Hello class, so today we are continuing on our discussion of epistemology. So once again, epistemology in philosophy is the philosophy of knowledge. So how is it that we're understanding knowledge? And we're continuing on through reason and also, or rationalism and empiricism. So, in other words, reason is going to have a place here, but it's going to have a place in the sense that it is something that David Hume, the philosopher David Hume, is skeptical of, okay? So, in other words, we need to set this up to understand that David Hume, who was an 18th century Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, is an empiricist. And so empiricism at that time stood in contrast to rational philosophy. And so rational philosophy, as we looked at with Descartes, is then emphasizing how it is that we're understanding reason, okay? So in other words, Descartes emphasized the place of reason in terms of how it is that we know things, and Hume as an empiricist. So empiricism is the philosophical way in which we understand knowledge epistemologically by way of the senses, okay? And so for Hume, it is the senses that get us to how it is that we understand things, okay? And this is something that positions Hume to be skeptical of the place of reason. So, in other words, you have the contrast between rational thought and then also you have the contrast between rational thought and empiricism, okay? So, Hume is an empiricist. He was born in 1711 and died in 1776. So he also is an Enlightenment philosopher, maybe even known as the Scottish philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment. Okay, so the passages I'm having you read are again from Velasquez, and we open with chapter on subchapter on Hume and skepticism. So in that subchapter, Velasquez is showing us that Hume was interested in showing us that the only way in which we understand things is by way of sense impressions. So in other words, our sense impressions having to do with seeing, touching, tasting, smelling, hearing, etc., are the only ways in which we have knowledge of the world, hence the emphasis on his epistemology and his empiricism, okay? So, in other words, we have impressions, and then we have ideas that are agglomerations of those impressions, okay? So, ideas are way that we put together our sense impressions. So we put together our sense impressions by way of ideas for Hume, okay? So ideas are agglomerations of impressions, and impressions are the basic sense impressions that you get from the sensory input, okay? From your perception, okay? So impressions are perceptual, and we have ideas that are born from that. So that's the way that our mind puts that together for Hume, okay? So what that does is it shows us that the basic way in which we understand things is by way of sense impressions. But I think what's key there, and what could trip people up too, is the way that he's understanding ideas. That in other words, we have the example of a so-called golden mountain. So the golden mountain is interesting because yes, we have an empirical perception of gold, and yes, we have an empirical perception of mountain, but when it comes together as an idea, we could have a golden mountain in fiction. So it doesn't have to be something that we have a sensory impression of as a golden mountain, but we do have sensory impressions of each one of those things. We bring that together to be an idea, okay? So that's where ideas are interesting for Hume, because it shows us perhaps some of this way that we're thinking of the problem of causation, okay, for Hume. And so that's what we're going to look into next. So in other words, we have impressions and ideas in terms of how it is that we're getting knowledge for the world, of the world, by way of Hume, okay? So we also have the problem of causation, okay? And so the problem of causation for Hume is rather interesting, and it seems insignificant, but we're going to see that by way of the problem of induction, that it will be something that is relevant to the way that we're understanding things in terms of knowledge, okay? So with the problem of causation, we have that when we have one event following another, and the classic example for Hume is the billiard balls. So in other words, when we have one billiard ball hitting another, okay, we have the cause and effect. So we have a way that we understand cause and effect. One thing causes another. One cause has the effect of something else. Okay, so in other words, we have something that is caused and we have its effect. Okay, so cause and effect is typically, apart from Hume, a way that we understand rational thought as well. So causation is a way that we understand reason. Okay, so in other words, it is reasonable to assume that one thing causes another. Okay, so in other words, remember that Hume is skeptical of the place of reason because he's an empiricist. So he wants to show us that all we have is sense impression. So as a result, when we have causation, what we usually think is that there's a necessary connection between the cause and the effect. That in other words, we have cause and effect, the billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, okay? And what we usually do in the way that we understand that as a point of knowledge, by way of cause and effect, is we think that there is a necessary connection between the two events, okay? The cause and the effect. We think that there's a necessary connection, and that necessary connection is rational, apart from Hume, okay? So what Hume is then doing is he's saying, I am skeptical of the necessary connection between cause and effect in terms of calling into question the way that we understand this basic way that we understand things rationally. So in other words, he's showing us that the rationalist way of understanding cause and effect is that there's a necessary connection. He is skeptical of that necessary connection, and as a result, he calls rational necessity into question. He's skeptical of the rational necessity that we bring to bear when we understand the connection between cause and effect. Okay? So that's a basic way in which we're understanding causation and its problem for Hume. So in other words, we have the habit of doing this. So what he's saying is that there is the habit that we have of supposing that there's a necessary connection between a cause and an effect. Okay? So in other words, something that has happened in the past will happen the same way in the future. We see as a necessary connection when we're thinking rationally, but when we're thinking skeptically, like Hume, we're suggesting that it is just a habit, okay? So in other words, habit there is something that shows us the problem of induction. So the problem of induction has to do with this idea that we usually think that something in a way that something has happened in the past will be the way that it happens in the future. And so the problem of induction is that we draw the conclusion that everything that has happened a certain way in the past will happen the same way in the future. We only have the connection of habit there, and so he's skeptical that this will always be the case rationally. So Hume is skeptical of that rational connection we make. He suggests that it is only by habit. A rationalist will suggest that this is by a necessary connection, okay? That in other words, everything has a reason. That's not something that Hume believes. He's thinking more that we do this we draw this necessary connection by way of habit, okay? So I think that's good to get us started, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.